Okay, let's go ahead and start with Mark. And I forgot to turn my... I'll take it back here. Thank you. All right, we're going to have problems here tonight. There we go. Mark, the first gospel. Interesting note that I say here, the first gospel. It's not first in order, but it's the first gospel. It was the first gospel that was written. Now, why was Matthew put first?
Because of the birth of Jesus Christ.
Well, it shows the birth of Jesus Christ, but Luke actually does a better job of that.
It's transitioning from the Old to the New.
It is the natural transition from the Old Testament into the New Testament. Matthew, you remember he said, this happened to fulfill what the prophets had said. He said that over, I think it was 30 times that he alluded to it. 16 times he used that specific phrase. So he is, excuse me, Matthew is the natural transition. So it comes first, and actually it's almost the longest gospel. So it would naturally come first in that order. But it's not the first gospel that was written. Mark is actually the first gospel was written. You may ask, why do I say that? The reason that I say that is because, well, I didn't include it in this PowerPoint. I had it in the other one. Of the verses in Mark, I think it's about 70% of Mark's verses are reproduced in either Matthew or Luke. It's very clear that Mark was the source that both of these used to draw from. Now understand, in that day, plagiarism was not a problem. That it wouldn't have been looked down upon for Matthew to use Mark's work or Luke to use Mark's work. They were all working together. They had the same purpose, and there was no such thing as plagiarism. That's a modern concept. Don't steal my thoughts. In that day, wasn't a problem at all. Some people have questioned, well, why would Matthew use Mark? And we talked about that when we were looking at Mark. Matthew used Mark kind of as a reminder. You know, when you're gathered around talking with family and somebody remembers a story and it reminds you of another story, reminds you of another story. Matthew used Mark kind of as a jumping point to remind him of the things, and then he filled in gaps, filled in details with his gospel. But Mark was the first gospel. There are 4 different gospels for a reason. They were each written to a different audience, trying to convince people that Jesus was the Messiah. Matthew was written to more of a Jewish audience or a Gentile audience with a Jewish understanding. Mark, however, was written to a largely Roman audience who would have had very little understanding of Jewish tradition, Jewish history. But he's trying to convince this group of people. Luke was written to a Gentile audience who were more interested in the details. Convince me based on facts. Convince me based on... So when we read Luke, I mean, when you look just at the beginning of Luke, chapter 2, verse 1, at that time the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census would be taken throughout the Roman Empire. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. The details such as that are details, and there's one place when he gives like 3 or 4 different intersecting dates that show the facts and verify the timing of these things in ways that others can understand. John was written from a perspective of, let's refute those heretics who were saying that Jesus wasn't a human. So all of these Gospels were written by different authors for different purposes to different audiences. They all played together very differently. And there's a reason why we have 4 of them. It's going to be interesting for us to now read, after we've read Matthew, to move into Mark. When we look at the authorship of Mark, we'll ask in a minute who Mark is, and we'll talk about that. But it's a nearly unanimous feeling that the author of this gospel was John Mark. Now, in scholarship, that's really unusual to have a nearly unanimous, the opinions on whether Matthew actually wrote Matthew all over the board. Remember, none of the Gospels actually bear the name of their writer. In Paul's letters, he will say this letter is from Paul to the church here. None of the Gospels say this letter was written by so-and-so. We have to assume that. Now, when they handed out the letter, everybody in Matthew's church knew who wrote this letter because Matthew was their pastor. And it was very clear who the letter was. He didn't feel like he needed to put his name on it. Same thing with Mark. He didn't feel like he had to put his name on it. But the early church very early started to recognize that Mark was the author of this letter. Papias was one of the church fathers. He wrote in AD 140 that this was clearly written. He said he had it on firsthand account from John that John Mark had written this gospel. In Clement of Alexandria in AD 150, looks like I got my parentheses in the wrong place there. AD 150 also said the same thing, that this gospel was written by Mark, who got his information from Peter and wrote down what Peter had to say. Now, I think it's Clement that says that Mark was not trying to give an ordered account. He was just trying to recapture all of Peter's teaching, not necessarily in the order in which they happened. So, Mark wrote the letter, but he got his information from Peter. When we read about Peter, we read about Peter a lot in Matthew. We'll read a lot about Peter here. Some of the characteristics that jump out about Peter. He's very hot-headed. He's very quick to speak. He says what's on his mind. He talks a lot. He doesn't appear to us to be the most detail-oriented person. You know what I'm saying? Or he pays attention to some detail, but not all detail. He doesn't pay attention to the details of what happened when. He pays great attention to the setting. For example, when he talks about feeding the 4,000, he's going to tell us what color the grass was that they sat on. He remembers the grass was green, but he doesn't remember what happened when. Some could say this is a typical guy. His view of details is very different. And the Gospels were not written, and part of the controversy that we see, people outside of the church that will say, well, you can't trust these books because they're not written in order. They're all over the place. The letters were not written to be a biography as we buy a biography today. I mean, if we were to buy a biography today and it didn't say anything about where the person grew up or what their life was like growing up, we'd say, well, this is a waste of time. That's a very different concept of a biography in our world is what they viewed a biography as of then. And again, it wasn't to be a biography, it was to give them the basic facts of who Jesus was. And was Jesus the Messiah? And to prove it. So let's ask this question. Who is Mark? Mark he's not a disciple. He's not one of the 12. Very little actual interaction with Jesus. In fact, there's only one situation where we think it might have been him. We first, we gather a little bit of information about Mark from what we read in the book of Acts. His name was John Mark. John was a common Jewish name. Marcus was his Roman name. He would be called by one or another depending on who he was with, whether he was with Jews or if he was with Gentiles. He was a son of a well-to-do lady, and he was the nephew of Barnabas. So we know this much about John Mark. He was first mentioned in Acts chapter 5, verse 12, or chapter 12, verses 5 through 12. Do I have that up there? Yep, there it is. Okay. So, but while Peter was in prison, the church prayed very earnestly for him. The night before Peter was placed on trial, he was asleep, fastened with 2 chains between 2 soldiers. Others stood guard at the prison gate. Suddenly there was a bright light in the cell, and an angel of the Lord stood before Peter. The angel struck him on the side to awaken him and said, "Quick, get up," and the chains fell off his wrists. Then the angel told him, "Get dressed and put on your sandals," and he did. "Now put on your coat and follow me," the angel ordered. So Peter left the cell following the angel, but all the while, he thought it was a vision. He didn't realize it was actually happening. They passed the first and second guard posts and came to the iron gate leading to the city, and this opened for them all by itself. So they passed through and started walking down the street, and suddenly the angel left him. Peter finally came to his senses. "It's really true," he said. "The Lord has sent his angel and saved me from Herod and what the Jewish leaders had planned to do to me." When he realized this, he went to the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark, where many were gathered for prayer. So this is the first time that we're introduced to John Mark. Peter has been in prison for preaching the gospel. Herod has planned to kill him because he's just killed James, and he saw how that pleased the people, so he's planning on killing Peter. And the angel rescues Peter out of jail, and Peter went to the home of John Mark, the mother of Jesus, or Mary, the mother of John Mark. So who was Mark? He was the son of a lady who owned a house. Now, it's interesting that they say the lady who owned the house, because women in that culture typically did not own. If a husband died, the property would go to her sons or to her brother-in-laws, but not to her. She had some resources to be able to own a house. That's significant. So we know that John Mark's mother was a wealthy person. It is also thought that perhaps Mark was referring to himself when he wrote in Mark chapter 14, one young man followed behind, was clothed only in a long linen shirt. When the mob tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and ran away naked. Do you guys know that was in the Bible? Do you know that we believe that John Mark may have been the first streaker? Some scholars wonder, and we can't know this with certainty, but we wonder if perhaps the Last Supper was held at the home of John Mark, and perhaps at that time his father was still alive. So the Last Supper was held at John Mark's father's house. That was the upper room. That was the man who owned the house. And so after dinner, John Mark had kind of been keeping an eye out for this Jesus guy. After dinner, Jesus and his disciples go out to the Mount of Olives, or to the Garden of Gethsemane, and maybe John Mark snuck out and followed behind. Now, part of the reason that this is interesting is because when Jesus is going to pray, and he asks his disciples to pray, and he goes on beyond, but the disciples fall asleep, and Jesus came back and checked on them and woke them up, and Jesus went back and prayed, and then Jesus came back and saw them asleep and left them asleep and went back to pray. Who wrote that down? Who knew that? Who would know that except a little boy who was hiding, watching to see what was going to happen? And then, when things got touchy and the guards showed up and he's ready to take off and he gets scared, he wants to run home to mom and dad, and they see him, they tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and he runs away. Now that's kind of an interesting way to look at this. It's interesting to understand. How did these details show up in the Bible? I mean, if all the disciples were asleep, who would know that Jesus came back one more time and said, let them sleep? Somebody was there watching that. I believe that it was a young man who was watching to see what was going on, then got scared and ran home. Mark starts to show up again in the book of Acts in chapter 12. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission to Jerusalem, they returned, taking John Mark with them. So Barnabas has decided he's going to take his nephew in, and John Mark is going to travel with them. In chapter 13, there in the town of Salamis, they went to the Jewish synagogues and preached the word of God. John Mark went with them as their assistant. Chapter 15. After some time, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit each city where we previously preached the word of the Lord, and see how the new believers are doing. Barnabas agreed and wanted to take along John Mark, but Paul disagreed strongly since John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. Their disagreement was so sharp that they separated. Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed for Cyprus. Now, how would you like to go down as the guy who broke up Paul and Barnabas? You realize how significant this little boy was. I mean, he was a man at this point, but he was a man who had kind of gotten scared. He ran in the garden that night, and then he got scared or whatever, and ran on this journey. You kind of see this pattern developing with this young man. And Paul says, I've had enough of this guy. I don't want anything else to do with him. I'm not taking him with me. He deserted us. Now, in that culture, desertion, that's a pretty strong claim. That's pretty yellow-bellied, as we would say in recent culture. And they didn't want anything to do with, or Paul didn't want anything to do with John Mark. Paul also chose Silas, and he left. The believers entrusted him to the Lord's gracious care, and he traveled through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening churches there. So Paul went his own way, and Barnabas went his own way. However, it doesn't end there. Paul writes this, Aristarchus, who is in prison with me, sends you his greetings, and so does Mark, Barnabas' cousin. As you were instructed before, make Mark welcome if he comes your way. So now all of a sudden, Paul has found that Mark is a valuable person. In Philemon, he's sending greetings again, and he says, so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my co-workers. So he considers, in Philemon, he considers Mark to be a co-worker. In 2 Timothy, he says, only Luke is with me, but bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry. 2 Timothy is Paul's last letter. He knows that he's going to die very soon. This is the passage where he asks for his coat and his papers. And bring John Mark with you, because he's helpful to me in my ministry. So we see that going from this immature kid who got into a situation he shouldn't have been in, going on a journey with Uncle or Cousin Barnabas, whichever way you read it, and now all of a sudden, he's very useful. Interestingly, this time when he is with Paul, when Paul says, bring John Mark to me, this is the time that John Mark is writing his gospel. One of the reasons that Paul may have said, bring him with me because he's useful to me, is because at this point, Mark has researched the life of Jesus. He has captured all that all that Peter has told, and Paul wants to hear, tell me again what you learned from Peter of who Jesus was. Read to me again what you wrote about who Jesus was. Because remember, the New Testament didn't exist then. At this time, there are no Gospels that we have today in circulation. But Paul wanted to be reminded of who Jesus was. And he wanted to hear that from someone who had researched that and written this letter. Bring Mark with you, because he's useful to me in my ministry. So let's move on to when Mark would have been written. Most scholars date Mark between the years of 50 and 62 AD. Originally thought to have been written as early as 50. And here's the parameters on the dates of this book. Acts was written in AD 62, which is at the end of Paul's 2-year imprisonment in Rome. And Luke writes the book of Acts after he has written the Gospel of Luke. Luke used John Mark's letter as the foundation for his Gospel. So you see that it had to have been before 62, because Luke has already used this in order to write his Gospel, which was finished around 61, between 60 and 61, because Acts was finished in 62. Peter was martyred in AD 64, as was Paul. Mark's gospel is very open with the humanity and mistakes of Peter. Even though this is Peter's story, he doesn't hide Peter's humanity. And if Peter was already dead, his position within the church would not be endangered. So there was no risk for him to expose those mistakes of Peter. So a lot of people believe that it was written to kind of tell this from Peter's perspective, and it was okay because Peter was still alive and could confirm any of the details. The way that this gospel is written, it can be used to strengthen a suffering church. I used Proclaim for my Sunday night for the first time this week, and I didn't do it all quite right. So, I'm trying to sort it out here. We can't be certain as to the date because he didn't put his name on it and he didn't date it. But somewhere between 50 and 70, I say somewhere between 50 and 60. he wrote this gospel, so that it was available for Luke when Luke wrote his gospel and when Matthew wrote his gospel. Where was it written from? This should be the next slide. The gospel was written while Mark was in Rome with Peter. Now, that plays in a lot to the writing of this gospel. As we're getting ready to see, the fact that this was written from Rome has significant impact on the gospel. This was written to those in Rome who wanted to remember what Peter had taught them. Now, in today's culture, some of you may appreciate when you hear a sermon and you want to remember, what did the pastor say? You write it down. A lot of you collect the DVDs so that you can go back and watch, so we can remember, especially as we go through the New Testament, what was said. In those days, they did not have the technology that we have today. Quite honestly, very few people could read and write on their own. And if they could, papyrus to write on was very expensive. So just to be able to take notes, not a cheap endeavor. So they wanted someone to write down in full. You know, if we're going to use a piece of paper, let's use it to the fullest. Someone to write down in full all that Peter had taught. So that was the job that Mark grabbed. Now, it doesn't sound like Peter just sat down with Mark one day and said, let me tell you the stories. It sounds like, the way that scholars view this, it sounds like Mark was there in the audience, in the church congregation, listening to Peter teach, and he was remembering and taking notes so that he could compile this all. It wasn't that Peter said, write this down. It was Mark remembering this and writing it down. How many of you have read the devotional My Utmost for His Highest? Who wrote that book? Actually, Oswald Chambers did not write that book. Did you know that? His wife wrote that book after Oswald Chambers' death. She wrote that book based on her sermon notes that she had kept from his preaching. All of the devotionals are actually mini sermons. She had compiled these notes. Now, his name is on it because it's his material. But it was actually his wife that wrote this book after his death. It's very similar here, even though we don't believe that Peter was dead at this point. Mark was writing down Peter's sermons and putting these into a format that could be compiled so that everyone could come back and read and know what Peter had taught them. One of the things that's interesting, and one of the things that plays into this, is that Mark translates Aramaic expressions into the Greek for their benefit. Meaning that he understands that the audience he's speaking to or writing to does not understand Aramaic, which was the language that the Hebrews spoke mostly at that time. So he translates them into Greek. Let's look at some of these. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, but Jesus nicknamed them the sons of thunder. He translates that passage. Holding her hand, he said to her, Talitha Kium, which means, little girl, get up. Looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, Ephphatha, which means, be opened. And I have no idea how to pronounce these, just in case you're wondering. Abba, Father, he cried out, everything is possible. That one doesn't look like it lines up. Then at 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. Yeah, you know. Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So you see in this that Mark is writing to an audience that doesn't understand this language. But he wanted to put this in there especially because the next phrase he said, but they thought he was calling for Elijah when he said, Eloi, Eloi. So he wanted this exact phrase in there, but he knew that the people who he was writing to would not understand them. This was Greek to them. Actually, this was Aramaic, and they spoke Greek. So he wanted to include this so that they would know what this actually meant. He also explains Greek expressions by their Latin terms. Then a poor widow came and dropped 2 small coins in, and some translations give a different take on that. Actually, I don't know what these are. I must have got the wrong verses in there. Anyway, there's 2 places where he translates the Greek into the Latin into the Greek as well. So he translates these terms that somebody wouldn't understand into the terminology that the Greeks would understand. So what was the purpose of this gospel? It was to retain the teachings of Peter and encourage a persecuted church and to refute heretical theological teachings. It's hard to believe that this soon after Jesus, that there were heretics that were taking this and making the gospel something that it wasn't meant to be. They were doing it that early. They did it. They've done it ever since. It's nothing new for people to get on TV and preach a gospel that does not exist. It's been happening since the beginning of the church. The character of the gospel, the first thing that I want us to understand is the rapid movement that we're going to see in Mark. Now, already in Mark today, we read like 2 chapters of Matthew and 3 chapters of Luke. He just moves so fast, covering the details. Matthew is, how many chapters was Matthew?
28.
How many chapters is Mark? 16. He moves much faster than the other writers do. The Greek word for straightway is found over 40 times. In fact, I think it's like 5 times in the first chapter in what you read today. Now, the New Living Translation translates it a variety of ways, as does the NIV. But this Greek word that says right away shows up over 40 times in this gospel. He focuses on the activities of Jesus, not on the teachings of Jesus. So in Matthew had 5 major blocks of teaching. We had the Sermon on the Mount. We had the sending of the disciples. Mark doesn't look at the teachings of Jesus as much. There's not quite as much red letters in your Bibles in Mark as there is in Matthew. He's concerned about the actions of Jesus. There's Roman influence in this as well. And it's important for us to understand this as well. The Romans looked at things very differently than the Jews did. There's no genealogy in the book of Mark. Did you read that this morning? I mean, there's no genealogy. It didn't say anything about where Jesus came from. It doesn't talk about Jesus' birth at all. Now, for the Jewish population, that was important. They had to know that Jesus was descended from David. The Jews had to know that he was born of a virgin. Romans don't care about any of that stuff. They don't care who his great-grandfather was. They wouldn't have known him anyway. So there's no genealogy. Mark has 13 verses before the ministry of Jesus began. Matthew has 76. Luke has 183. He moves immediately. I mean, he talks about John the Baptist briefly, but then immediately into the ministry of Jesus. So again, we're looking at somebody that doesn't care about the gushy details that help this make sense. We're looking at somebody that just gets the facts. Jesus is presented in this gospel as a conqueror. He conquers demons, he conquers disease, and at the end he conquers death. Now the Romans were conquerors. So this, to a Roman audience, this says, this is the kind of God we're interested in. A God who conquers. But Jesus was also portrayed as a servant. Servants do not parade pedigrees. Servants offer service, and this is what Jesus did. So he was the conquering servant. Now, in the Roman world, if you conquered, you didn't serve anybody. For Jesus to be portrayed as a conquering servant, this was 2 completely different personalities that Mark was bringing together to show that the true picture of Jesus is he was conquering, yes, but he also served. Should we as Christians conquer? By all means, we should have victory in our lives. But should we do it in arrogance? Absolutely not. We should be servants. So we're going to see these themes tied together in Mark's gospel. The divinity of Jesus. This is one of the heresies that was floating around and caused great problem in this era. People were starting to say, well, you know, we've got a lot of gods. None of our gods ended up on a cross. So you don't have a God here. You've got a great man, or you got a good teacher. Have you heard that before? But you don't have a God. Mark starts out his gospel, and he makes no bones about who he believes Jesus to be. He is divine. Mark chapter 1, verse 1. This is the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. That's pretty clear as to who he thinks Jesus is. Chapter 1, verse 22. The people were amazed at his teaching, for he taught with real authority, quite unlike the teachers of religious law. Now, we talked about authority this morning. Jesus says, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Jesus had real authority when he taught, quite unlike the teachers of the law. Like me, I don't have authority when I teach. He had authority when he taught. Amazement gripped the audience, and they began to discuss what had happened. What sort of new teaching is this, they asked excitedly. It has such authority. Even the evil spirits obey his orders. This is authority. This is the Son of God who has authority. This isn't somebody who just rides around on a horse and says, oh, listen to my teaching. There's some authority to this teaching. Chapter 4, verse 41. The disciples were absolutely terrified, they ask each other. Who is this man, they ask each other. Even the winds and the waves obey him. There's not a Roman general or Roman Caesar who had ever controlled the weather. They may have prayed to their many gods, please stop this storm so I can kill them, but they had never been able to stand up and say, peace be still, and have the sea go to glass. This is authority. This is not the kind of authority that the Romans knew anything about. It's ultimate authority. But it wasn't just the divinity of Jesus. He showed the divinity of Jesus, but he also wanted to show Jesus' humanity. Have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus was really human? Think about what that means. He had problems with his shoes at times too. Did you ever think about that? Bruce Marciano, who plays the role of Jesus in the video Matthew, which is a verse-by-verse interpretation. I think the Bettendorf Church had a copy of Matthew. Bruce Marciano says that this really hit him one day when he was on the set. They were in the middle of a scene, and all of a sudden the strap on his sandal broke. And he was angry. He's like, what in the world? Who made a terrible sandal for me? Come on, didn't they know what role I was going to have? And he was bending down to try to fix it so he could get through the scene. And he said, I felt like the Lord spoke to me and said, you know, my sandals broke too. You know, I'm human too. I was human too. I went through everything you go through. Jesus dirtied diapers too. He was human. You get this. Let's look at some of the verses, and there's a ton of these. Then they scoffed, he's just a carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and his sisters live right here with us among us, right here among us. They were deeply offended and refused to believe in him. You see, sometimes Jesus' humanity got in the way. Because he was teaching with real authority, and they were amazed. But they were saying, wait a second, we know his mom, we know his brothers. His brothers have been in trouble since day one. He was human. That one ended up in the wrong spot. Chapter 8, verse 12. When he heard this, he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why do these people keep demanding a miraculous sign? I mean, catch the humanity in that moment. Why do these people keep demanding miraculous signs? You see his humanity in that. I mean, he had to sigh and roll his eyes at people just like we do. He saw the huge crowds as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. He had compassion. Is this the first time that Jesus had ever seen this group of people? Jesus knew these people before they were born. He knew who they were going to be. And yet, when he saw them, he had compassion on them. He said, I'm tired as can be. He's trying to get away from people is why he's on the boat. He gets off the boat, though. He looks at them. He has compassion, and he teaches them. He ends up feeding them that day, too. He was amazed at their unbelief. It's a human part of us to get frustrated when someone just doesn't get it. How stupid can you be? I created your brain. I know it works better than that. You just got to turn it on. can imagine Jesus saying some of these things. He looked around at them angrily and was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. He had emotions just like we have. He got upset when people were missing the point entirely. In this setting, the leaders had brought a man to Jesus on the Sabbath, a man with a withered hand, trying to trap him and saying, what are you going to do? Are you going to heal him on the Sabbath? You can't do things like that on the Sabbath, can you? And Jesus got pretty upset with them because they were missing the point. What? The man has never had use of his hand, and you bring him to me to flaunt that? Oh, your hard hearts. He was angry, but he was also sad because of why they were acting this way. It disturbed him that they had such hard hearts. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples and then reprimanded Peter. Get away from me, Satan, he said. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. This shows more of Peter's humanity, but Jesus' acknowledgement of Peter's humanity. You're seeing things merely from a human point of view. There are two ways to view things. Humanly speaking, a lot of what happens in our world is horrific. From God's perspective, a lot of those horrific things can be used to get a lot of people's attention. Don't just see things from a human point of view. When Jesus saw what was happening, he was angry with his disciples. This is when the disciples were keeping the children from coming. He was angry with them because they were telling the kids to go away. You catch that? Now, Matthew says he rebuked them. Mark says he got angry with them. Don't stop them. Let the little children come to me, for the kingdom of God belongs to those who are like these children. Looking at the man, this is a rich young man, Jesus felt genuine love for him. I love the way the New Living Translation puts this. Jesus felt genuine love for him. When the rich young ruler, sometimes we think that this arrogant guy comes up to Jesus and Jesus just passes him off. But one thing that stood out to Peter is that when this man came to Jesus, Jesus didn't just write him off. Jesus looked at him and had genuine love for him. Have you ever had anybody look at you and you could tell they loved you? There's a difference between that and someone just looking at you and rolling their eyes. Jesus looked at them and had genuine love for them and said, there's still one thing you haven't done. Jesus got hungry. Do you know that? Think about that. Jesus had to eat too. He had a body. Next morning as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Jesus needed rest. And Jesus said, let us go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest. He said this because there were so many people coming and going that he and his disciples didn't even have time to eat. It gets busy sometimes, and Jesus said, we've got to pull away from this and rest. Could Jesus have kept going? Absolutely. Could his disciples? Mm-mm. And Jesus had a human body too. While he could give himself supernatural strength, and he did, he chose to give in to that human body and say, we've got to rest. Is that the last of it, maybe? It's not going any further. That must be the end of it. Which is interesting because it's the end of our time. As you read through Mark this week, and we didn't look at the content of what we're going to read this week, we'll get back to that next week. But as you read through Mark this week, I want you to understand this is a completely different perspective than Matthew. We're not going to have great sections of teaching. We're not going to look at the genealogy of Jesus. We're not going to look at his birth. Mark doesn't say a word about his birth. It just says that Jesus was the Son of God. Boom. And here's what Isaiah had to say about John the Baptist. So we're going to see action. It's going to be rapid movement, quick movement. But understand some of the influences that this has. It's written to a different audience. It's written to an audience more like us, that we would understand, because we are not Jews. We're not of that descent, so we don't understand and appreciate the genealogy of Jesus. And we're in a society that understands conquering too, don't we? I mean, we understand war. That's something that we see very regularly on TV. Not that we experience it, most of us, but we see it on TV anyway. But we can understand this Jesus because Jesus was a conquering servant. Now, again, in our culture, it's very much like that culture. The conquerors are not humble. And the servants are typically not looked well upon. And Mark combines those two and says Jesus was a conquering servant, which says that we still have victory, but we are to serve in our victory. So, should be an interesting week. I hope you enjoy starting out with Mark. And as you read it, if you have questions, mark them. We'll look at them again next week. Send me an email, give me a call, and we'll work through it. So, does that sound like fun? Ready to read Mark? Did anybody try to keep up with the Proclaim tonight in the 3,000 Bible verses? Everybody put their iPads away. There was a lot of verses tonight, but I wanted to try Proclaim on a Sunday night. Hopefully next week would be a little bit better. So, all right. Well, let's go ahead and close with prayer. Bob, pray for us, please.
Father, we thank you again for reminding us, Lord, that the time when we go through trials, whatever they may be, of hunger, or loss of loved ones, or financial, or destruction of property, whatever, Lord, it may be, that even though you were God, you were human also, and you went through these same trials, and you know these same feelings, and Lord, you understand what we go through. So help us to remember, Lord, that you said in your word, you never leave us or forsake us, that you will be with us forever. And all I have to do is keep our eyes upon you, trust and believe, and allow you to work in our lives. We just thank you, and let our lives be glorified to you. We pray this in your precious name.
Amen. All right.